here with Viante New Mexico. I want to give you an update on the first 30 days of this year's, the 2021 60-day legislative session. What has happened so far and what can we expect moving towards the finish line of March 20th? First and foremost, I want to talk about the type of session that we're experiencing. It's a hybrid one with some in-person, although it's only to the lawmakers or the legislators, and mostly online, especially if you're a member of the public. House Democrats have been really complimentary of this process. In fact, Speaker Egoff is on the record saying that there has been over 6,000 folks who have tuned into the legislative committee meetings and have been able to give public comment. Now, I don't know if that number is specific to the House or it also takes into account the Senate numbers, but those are a lot. But I can testify too that while you're in the roundhouse, there's hundreds of people there too. I don't know if I could count thousands, but there's engagement in person as well. But to that same point, House Republicans are concerned that their constituents aren't able to engage like they previously could. When you're in a committee room, there's just something to it when you're giving public comment and you can see the reactions on people's faces. Are they receiving the information that you're giving to them? And is it something that you want to change tactics, or do you want to plug in a different point if someone looks a little bored? So there's a challenge, but also there's a huge gap with broadband in New Mexico, which is why Viante is focusing on it this year. And Republican lawmakers say a lot of their constituents are in rural New Mexico who don't have the bandwidth to plug in to be able to give the public comment that they want on important issues. So that gap has presented some challenges too. And really, that's the only mode of being able to voice your opinion in a committee room as they're considering bills. So that's a barrier. Speaker Egoff has said, though, that Zoom is here to stay. And whatever the legislative sessions look like in the future, that they're going to try and incorporate a piece of it so that way of Zoom. So if you're not able to travel up to Santa Fe, you can still participate, which is great because New Mexico is the 5th largest state in this country. And so it makes the travel time quite challenging for some. So by and large, though, it's going smoothly. There's a lot of, oh, I think you're on mute, or are they here? We don't see their icon, or my internet cut out. But I mean, they work through it pretty well. They've been able to navigate how to move on with their agendas. Another nice thing about being online is the fact that the committee meetings are starting on time. That was something that was always a struggle when you were at the roundhouse. You never really knew if it was going to start right at 8 or is it going to be more like 8:40, 8:45. Everything I've seen so far is right on time, with the exception of those afternoon committee meetings. If the floor session's taking a little bit long, they may be pushed back, but they are very punctual, and that's great as somebody who participates in this session and is just going along with the schedule that they set out for me. Now, let's talk about our revenue and our budget outlook. So New Mexico's reoccurring spending is at $7.2 billion. This past week, we got an updated revenue projection that tells lawmakers how much can they spend during the session. Back in the winter time, well, in like December-ish, there was a revenue projection that was a little bit higher than what they were anticipating. It was, I think, like $160 million plus. That was more, and that was great. They were excited. But this new one that came out this past week now gives us over $338 million in above and beyond that $7.2 million or billion dollars that they're already spending. The person that's really powerful in this mix is Senator George Munoz. He is the Senate Finance Committee chair, and he still gives an air of caution, not knowing what the future holds, not knowing how the state is going to recover from the pandemic. He is urging lawmakers to not just take that money and run with it, but let's he wants them to be more strategic and if they save it or what they spend it on. So revenue is in a good spot. Now we just need to keep an eye on how it's being spent. Now the issues that have been discussed so far. I want to start off the top with what we care about with Viante, and that's broadband. So far, we've had 22 bills that have been introduced. Of that, 2 bills fit within our criteria. And what we're looking for is funding for state staff to better coordinate the broadband projects that we have in New Mexico. In addition to that, we're hoping that this state entity can help get all these federal funds and grants that are ripe for our taking and bring them back to the state. For decades now, we just haven't had that comprehensive, strategic, coordinating effort to bring that federal money back to our state. Our hope is that this entity can help with that, along with tracking our success and forecasting future needs and opportunities. So those 2 bills are Senate Bill 93 and House Bill 10 that Viante is really monitoring and pushing along in the process. We have great hope that we're going to be able to do that this year. We want to talk about redistricting. So the census happened last year, and that's really important because that now gives lawmakers the opportunity to redefine or redraw districts to make sure that they have the population that is needed. There's a couple bills moving through the process there. Look promising, but they really haven't crossed over into the other chamber yet. So still keeping an eye on if that gets addressed, because this is the year that it needs to get done. And it's not something that can be pushed off to 2022. Lawmakers have to prioritize it if it's something they want to pass. Next topic is abortion rights. This is a controversial one that Viante doesn't work on per se, but I want to give you an update on. In years past, it has been held up in the Senate. There was conservative Democrats that never really let it get beyond that point into the governor's desk, but this year looks like it's the year that it will pass. Just for some context, in years past, there were 8 Democrats that voted against having the abortion bill go forward. This year, there was only 2 that voted against it. And I want to clarify, I want to make sure I said that right. There was 8 Democrats previously that voted against the abortion bill. Now there was only 2. And that is a reflection of the fact that elections really matter. A lot of those conservative, more moderate Democrats were voted out, and now we're seeing it reflected in legislation and where it's going. Then there is great momentum around, and when I say great, it's like fast moving, not characterizing it as great, bad, otherwise, but there's momentum behind the land grant permanent fund and tapping into that more for, in this case, they're looking for early childhood education. Historically, conservative folks, whether they be Democrat or Republican, have been against tapping more into this multi-billion-dollar fund because it will hurt a lot of our bond ratings and will have a ripple effect on other finances for the state. Democrats who are in support of it have always said that this is the time to invest. Let's take the money that is there and do something with it. It doesn't seem as though this is a sure thing, but it does have more promise than in years past. Some of the concerns that are being raised is whether or not the money should be earmarked and what it should be earmarked for. Right now, it's saying specifically for early childhood education. It could be that people want, well, it is that people want it perhaps for teacher salaries or just different distributions from that. So we'll see where that plays out this year, but it has a stronger likelihood, but not a sure thing. And then, of course, we have the cannabis regulation bills that are making their way through the process. There were a few competing ones, and the major issue here is whether or not to put production caps on the recreational use of cannabis and producing it, of course. And that was kind of settled when there was the two House bills that were competed, because the bill that would have put production caps on things died in committee. The one that doesn't have one is moving forward. And that one that's moving forward is kind of like a omnibus bill, or a really large bill, because it tackles a lot of different things. It's looking at social justice. It's looking at imposing different regulations without going through a regulating entity. So that one has a lot of traction, but the concerns are still there around production caps and making sure this bill doesn't try and do too much too soon, because the folks who are against it, and these folks are Democrats, mind you, are pointing to California and Oregon as case studies of don't do too much too soon and make sure that you don't have more supply than demand. Well, it's gaining steam, and we'll see where it all pans out by the end of the session. With that, I think that's really the best picture of what's happening right now. It's just a bit strange not being in the roundhouse and having that buzz and excitement of being in the rotunda that's in the middle part of the Capitol, where there's presentations happening all the time and rallies and a bunch of folks flooding a committee room. So that element is a little bit lost. There's some instances where I've seen more decorum, where people are, like the legislators, are more respectful of one another's thoughts, opinions, processes of how they reach their conclusions. But then I've also seen cases where there's less decorum. In an example with that abortion bill, the bill sponsor refused to answer questions on the floor from her colleagues. And they said, it's a parliamentary thing, but they said, will you yield? And the sponsor would not yield. It didn't stop debate. Debate continued through other parliamentary processes, but I had not seen that before, and I thought it was interesting. So with that, that's where we're at. Thank you for watching. I'm sure this was a long video. I try and do it in one take, but I'll be checking in again, probably in a couple weeks, letting you know where things are sitting. Hopefully there's more bills that cross over into the other chamber. And then of course, by the end of the session, letting you know what everything happened. There was one main point that I wanted to touch on and I didn't. How many bills were filed by the deadline? And that number is 886 bills. For context, in 2019, that was the other 60-day session, there was 1,300 bills. So we saw significantly less bills that were introduced, and perhaps that was just because it was a virtual session, who knows, but still a lot of work ahead of the legislators, and we'll keep you in the loop. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're not already, please consider supporting Viante through a donation. That's what allows us to give you this transparent, nonpartisan look into what our state lawmakers are doing. You can find that information at Viante, VIANTE, NM as in New Mexico.org/donate. We'd really be grateful for your help. Thank you.